How's it going, everybody? We're going to conservatively say 10 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, November the 10th, 2019, and it's time for this week's edition of Riding in Cars with Cards. I'm sorry I didn't get one up last week. Lighting has been an issue since the time change. So normally I record it either driving to or coming home from work, and that is not a viable option when it is dark at both times of day. So we're going to have to get creative here. I'm just going to have to find time through the week and pre-record. That's how we're going to have to do this. So it may not be quite as typically up to date as we're accustomed to, but better to have content that's a little behind or a little ahead than no content at all, right? Right. We'll go with that. So I was going to tie this into last week's Homeward Path episode, but we'll just we'll start the cycle anew, where instead of going over the things we learned from it before we record the Homeward Path episode, let's talk about what we learned from last week's Homeward Path episode, and that is, the deck building in an oppressed format. Let's talk about the oppressor in the current standard. So today we're going to be talking about blue-green X food. Simic, Sultai, Bant, Tamer if you're feeling frisky. The core understanding of why this deck is so oppressive, why it's so good, why there's talks of another banning in Standard even after we just got Field of the Dead out of the format for this reason, falls squarely on the shoulders of just how oppressively powerful Oko Thief of Crowns is. And this is the deck that reliably casts it on turn 2. Not every game, but the games where you do feel like runaway home runs. So, for starters, let's just look at the shell. What's the core cards? What makes this deck tick? Every single variation on this deck, regardless of whether it's playing straight Simic, Bant, Sultai, Teamer, blue, green, and another color, whatever. They're all playing the same base cards. They're all playing the same configuration. All of them are base green. Because you start with Once Upon a Time, you start with Oko Thief of Crowns, you start with Wicked Wolf, you start with Gilded Goose. And then Nissa, who shakes the world, because top end matters. So what is it that makes this shell so dead-gum powerful? Well, it starts with the man himself, the Thief of Crowns himself, the Elk Master himself, Oko. Oko invalidates entire swaths of cards in the Standard format. The way I like to describe it, Oko invalidates any creature that you want to untap with. That's the long and short of it. If you want to untap with that creature for a specific reason, Oko's going to turn it off. Either because it's really efficient, at which point Oko's going to make it into a 3/3, and that may or may not be an upgrade depending on how you build your decks. But, if your goal is to play big, dumb creatures and get value out of them, Oko's going to see that that's not an issue. But then there's also the other half of it where if you want to rely on the text box of your creature, something like Questing Beast, something like Skargan Hellkite, something like Gruul Spellbreaker, something like Ironcrag Pyromancer, he's also going to invalidate those, because turning it into a 3/3, while in the case of something like Ironcrag Pyromancer or Gruul Spellbreaker doesn't seem that big a deal. In the case of Pyromancer, it makes it an upgrade as an attacker, but it removes the advantage. It removes the advantage to functionally attack for 3 on both players' turns. In the case of Gruul Spellbreaker, it removes the ability to protect yourself from cards like Edict effects on their turn, or what have you, whatever the case may be. Or just to protect the Spellbreaker from a removal spell on your turn. So even if you give it the +1/+1 counter, you also lose the trample, and you lose the, whatever. The advantage is lost. So that's the key thing about how Oko oppresses this format, this Standard format. If you are a creature that does not have haste or an enter the battlefield ability, Oko is going to invalidate you. I don't think I'm stretching the truth when I say that. Like, you're either a laundry list of tutus, at which point the other half of Oko takes over, where it can fuel itself with food and then turn that food into elks as chump blockers. You know, every other turn getting a free 3/3 chump blocker, and then later in the game, if you have any laying around, you can use them to gain life. That's a big deal too. But then there's this whole rest of the deck that it's got going on. Because you would think that, well, getting under this deck is one of the easiest ways to beat it. Playing something like Gruul, playing something like Red Deck Wins, playing something like Mono White. But then you have the rest of this deck where Gilded Goose comes down on turn 1, makes a food, casts your Oko on turn 2, which is usually going to make a food to be hard to attack to death. And then on 3, you just make another food, cast Wicked Wolf. Eat a food, eat a creature. Or, you know, if you're playing against Mono White, you just eat a creature. Gone. Now I've got a 3/3 that can become upwards of a 5/5 in combat and won't die. You know, it can trade with your 5/5, except it doesn't trade. It just eats these 2 foods I had left laying around. That's really good. That's really good against these aggro decks. And then you have Nissa, who will reward you for flooding out. And Nissa, who will give you big Hydroid Crisis. Nissa, who will give you more mana for bigger, dumber things. I mean, it allows you to cast your powerful 4-drops and still leave up mana for your Gilded Goose activation, so you can get even more food. So the core engine for this deck is one that Oko invalidates a lot of the things that you would use to beat them by going over the top. And then the rest of the deck invalidates the aggro matchups of the format by being just a really good mid-range core. Like classic big green mid-range. There's not a whole lot to say there. It is what it is. It's really good. So what do we look at in other colors? That's where we get interesting. The deck has warped the standard format so heavily that one of the most popular iterations of the deck is to play black so that you have access to main deck Noxious Grasp for your opponent's Okos. Or for your opponent's Nissa, or for your opponent's, it's just a catch-all removal spell against anything green or white, which also conveniently works against a Fairy Time Raveler. It conveniently works against basically any big dumb creature in the format that isn't named Skargan Elkite, which Oko takes care of. Like, top to bottom, you have this laundry list of things that Noxious Grasp hits. And especially with the food decks being the most played, it's another avenue to really take advantage of. And then you're already in blue, so you have access to Aether Gust and Mystical Dispute, which are also all-stars in the mirror because you can counter their turn 2 Oko on the draw by just playing an untapped blue source on turn 1, counter their turn 2 Oko, and then play your turn 3 Oko and start to take over the game. And then the other advantage to Sultai is access to Thought Erasure. Again, there's not a ton of black mana that needs to go into this deck, and then Goose helps smooth it out a little bit. But access to disruptive elements. Noxious Grasp is a premier removal spell right now. I mean, Noxious Grasp in conjunction with Oko can actually answer anything. Artifact or creature-wise, you can turn it into an elk and then kill it with Noxious Grasp and gain a life. These are things you can do. Oh, by the way, the Oko's still plussing to do this. Like, you don't need main deck artifact destruction because you have Oko. You can turn that artifact into an elk, and then you can Noxious Grasp it, or you can take it down the line. Trade them a food token for their elk. So, top to bottom, side to side, however you want to look at this deck, this core engine in Sultai food, it's got everything you want to beat the food mirrors. And then if you're looking at the Simic or the Bant variations, you're looking at decks that are better built to handle the field. Teferi Time Raveler in the Bant build is really good at stopping Wilderness Reclamation, which goes over the top in a way that Oko can't interact with. Although Veil of Summer and Mystical Dispute are really, really good against Explosion. Like, really good. But in the case of the Wilderness Reclamation player, being able to resolve a Niv Mizzet would be really strong, but then Oko turns it into an L. So you have to, like, leave up a bunch of stuff to do so that you can get a lot of value out of that Niv Mizzet before, it just, that weird little tension where I've said for the last 2 years, I've never lost a game that I've untapped with Niv Mizzet. Also haven't had my Niv Mizzet elked yet. I don't know what that feels like. It hasn't happened. Because I just don't play it if I think it's going to get invalidated. If I'm not going to get to take advantage of the card, I don't play the card. That's all I can say about that. But, the Bant version, Teferi Time Raveler does a good job handling kind of the weird combo out options at the ends of the format. And then access to white mana opens up access to Dovin's Veto after sideboard, which is a way to force through your plays in the mirror, or just another good counter for the cards that matter the most in the mirror, the Oko and the Nissa. And notably, it's a counter spell that doesn't get countered by Mystical Dispute. You still have Aether Gust. You can go into Devout Decree if you're playing against the Rakdos Sacrifice deck, because you can actually just exile the Mayhem Devil. Or the Judith, or the, whatever it is you're worried about, whatever it is they're doing that's causing you trouble. You can exile Liliana, Dreadhorde General. It's really good. Just get it out of here. Get it going. God, I'm trying to think. You look at the format as a whole, and there's the combination of really strong color hosers that this shell gets access to. Even if you're just playing Simic, you still have Veil of Summer, Aether Gust. Veil of Summer protects you in the Oko Mirror by invalidating their Thought Erasures and their Noxious Grasps, and being able to protect your cards from being elked. While drawing a card, usually. But then Aether Gust is also really good in the mirror because it dodges the indestructible clause on the Wicked Wolf. It tucks a Nissa into the deck before it gets to take advantage of the extra mana it made. Whatever. Like, even just those color hosers in straight Simic, it's a good place to be. And you still get to play all of the best cards in Standard. You just have smoother mana. So, like, the long and short of it, the thing that makes the deck good, the thing that makes the deck oppressive, is the idea that your core engine, your main card, the card that is so powerful that the deck exists, invalidates the kinds of cards that would be good against you. Because without Oko, you could outclass their creatures. You could outclass, you could create a value stream of cards that could build up over time. I've done it. Playing Izzet Draw 2. If you can keep the Oko off the board, Izzet Draw 2 lines up pretty well against them. Because you make this endless stream of 1/1s, and then, like, Wicked Wolf is kind of awkward against a deck that's playing Crackling Drake. Because even if you Wicked Wolf and sack a food, so that you trade up and Wicked Wolf doesn't die, that Crackling Drake drew a card, which triggered the abilities of all the Draw 2 ability. So I've still gotten card advantage out of it. It's the basic idea, again, of creating a scenario where the cards you're playing generate their value before they ever get interacted with. But a lot of it was because I countered their turn 2 Oko. I had to run main deck Mystical Dispute in the Is It Draw 2 deck because even I respect the capability of that card. Because it'll turn Ironcrag Pyromancer into an elk. You know, it'll steadily whittle down the numbers of fairy tokens that I have that are able to snipe down. Like, it creates a scenario where it's not even viable to attack into the Oko because you'd rather just kill them than waste a bunch of time trying to kill the Oko. And then as far as color hosers go in Is It, like, I've got Gust, which can tuck it, but then I have to counter it again. Or I've got Fry, which doesn't kill it. You know, so a lot of the time, the way I deal with an Oko is I just have to create a scenario where I can cast a Pyromancer, gain a draw 2 ability, and then present an attack that kills it. And why would I do that when I can just work on killing my opponent? Except then they make a bunch of food tokens and gain a bunch of life, and then it's hard to kill them that way too. And they start making a bunch of elks, and I have to start using my fairies as chump blockers. It's just this weird kind of, pardon the language, but damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. And that's at the heart of what makes this deck so oppressive. It's not that it occupies a position that we've never seen before. It's not that it does stuff we've never seen before. It does stuff I've seen before plenty of times. It invalidates entire classes of cards that would otherwise be good against it. And then by virtue of how it's built, it invalidates the rest of them. And the Mythic Championship numbers bear that out. 69% of day one competitors registered Gilded Goose, Oko, Wicked Wolf. In some number. 63%, when I looked at the numbers dead out, literally described their deck as either Simic, Sultai, or Bant food. 63%. We ran the numbers because the question was posed on Twitter, said, what's the most dominant day one percentage ever seen? You know, look at the history of Magic. Now, I will preface by saying I cannot find day one percentages of affinity in Standard. I just can't find it. It doesn't exist. I look at the old coverage articles and they just didn't check on that. So, that's not something that I'm going to be able to do. Yeah, I looked at Wikipedia articles. I looked all over the place. I can't find a percentage that Affinity occupied at its Pro Tours. And notably, back then, not every Pro Tour was Standard. And as a matter of fact, usually the only one that was Worlds. They would do a limited Pro Tour, a block constructed Pro Tour, an extended, or an extended Pro Tour, and then Worlds would be Standard, Extended, and Legacy. Or Standard, Extended, and Draft. Well, then we move into more modern times, and they have mostly Standard Pro Tours with limited rounds, especially after they killed off block constructed completely. And you can understand why I can't find it. But even you look back at some of the most dominant showings by a deck of all time. Fairies at its first Pro Tour, I think, finished in the mid-teens percentage. Callblade at its first Pro Tour, there was only one team on that deck. That was the weekend they broke it. So there weren't very many people on that deck. Well, then you start pushing things more forward. I didn't follow a lot during RTR or Innistrad, RTR, Theros, or Cons. I didn't check on all of that because best I can figure out, there wasn't anything that was just supremely dominant during that time. You know, the closest thing I can think, maybe I need to look at the numbers for Abs and Aggro during Con Standard. But you go all the way forward to when I started playing again. Pro Tour Eldritch Moon. Bant Company was maybe 18%. Pro Tour Kaladesh. Red-White Vehicles. 10-11% of the format. 10-11% of the day one metagame. Pro Tour Aether Revolt. The set that famously broke Standard for 2 years. Mardu Vehicles was the deck of the tournament, and it had 21, 22%. Four-color Saheeli ended up being the deck of the format before it got banned. And even like if you factor in Jeskai Saheeli, Jeskai Copycat Control, and four-color Copycat, it still amounted to about 8% of the field. Pro Tour Amonkhet. Ramenup Red. What? 11% maybe? Pro Tour Hour of Devastation. Or no, it wasn't. Pro Tour Amonkhet was Teamer Marvel. Was Aetherworks Marvel. 22, 23? Something like that. Pro Tour Hour of Devastation. Ramenup Red. 15? 16%? Pro Tour Ixalan. Teamer Energy. You wrap all the energy decks in that tournament together, which is any deck that was playing Attune with Aether, Rogue Refiner, Longtusk Cub, Aether Hub, and then any other cards that reference the word energy. And you still come out to about 45%. Sultai Food at Mythic Championship 6, or ostensibly Pro Tour Throne of Eldraine. It was the first event that these cards were legal for. The first huge event like this that they're legal for. Sultai Food alone was 37. And then you had Bant and Simic. Put together 63%. And that's not counting the weird little like four-color decks that made up part of the others. So obviously there is a problem. There's no reason to believe there's not a problem. There's way too much going on in that shell to justify not doing something to it. And we just talked about why. When you can invalidate the kinds of cards that would normally beat you, and then your deck invalidates an entire swath of the format, you're in really good shape. So, why would you not play this deck? You know, I don't look at it as players not trying hard enough. We are trying to the point that we're playing main deck, Noxious Grasp, Veil of Summers, Aether Gust, Devout Decree. Like we're doing everything we know to do to try to beat this deck. And it still puts up numbers like this. That says something. That says something about how dominant that stuff is. So, you know, if we're looking at the anatomy of a banning, look at the history of Magic. Cards get banned for one of three reasons. They're too powerful, they're too ubiquitous, or they cause trouble in tournament logistics by making rounds go to time too often. Well, cards that were banned because they were too powerful. Tolarian Academy, the Affinity deck, arguably Jace the Mind Sculptor and Stoneforge, Aetherworks Marvel, Felidar Guardian, Emrakul the Promised End. Cards that were banned because they were too ubiquitous, because they took up too much deck building space. It was too difficult to build decks without them in it. Stoneforge Mystic, Jace the Mind Sculptor, because once you started looking at, you know, there were Boros aggro decks in that format where you played Stoneforge Mystic and Swords, and then you play like a Bone Horde. Jace the Mind Sculptor in not Callblade decks, because if you were playing blue, why would you not play that card? It's so good. Smuggler's Copter. Reflector Mage. Why wouldn't you play those cards if Smuggler's Copter, if you're remotely interested in playing creatures, why wouldn't you play that card? Squeezes out room for other stuff. Reflector Mage. Invalidated an entire swath of creatures. That's another one that got banned for being too powerful. I'm sorry. The energy package. It wasn't necessarily that it was too powerful. It was the idea that you just, it was too easy to play. If you wanted to have good mana and a little bit of extra card advantage, you played the energy cards, and then eventually you ended up in the energy deck. There was no reason not to. They were really good, but they were also just really easy to play. Like they already did all the things you wanted your mid-range cards to do. Up until this year, Field of the Dead. Field of the Dead was banned in Standard largely because of the ubiquity of the deck. Not necessarily because it was so powerful. It was definitely a powerful Magic card, and it's definitely one that I look forward to revisiting in Pioneer. But the fact that so many people were playing it, and that was really the only thing keeping the Oko decks down, is a big part of why Field of the Dead got banned, ironically enough. So, and then, Oko doesn't really have a say in things like tournament logistics. Let's be real here. That's not an issue we're talking about with Oko. But at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about why, when we're talking about a deck that oppresses a format, this is the kind of thing we're talking about. It's powerful, too powerful, invalidating entire swaths of cards and decks. It's everywhere because it's too easy to just start with the food cards and then build the rest of your deck around them. It checks 2 out of the 3 boxes. So, as far as I'm concerned, the 18th can't get here soon enough. Probably going to craft me a set on Arena, though, because if they ban it, I want those wild cards back, but I want Okos for Pioneer or for Historic, whatever. Maybe they ban it there, too. Probably. I don't know. But also may just sit on it and ignore it like I did the last banning. I never crafted Field of the Dead either. Probably should have. Didn't do it. But that's all I got today, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Again, I don't like to do this kind of a video where it seems like I'm complaining, like I'm ranting about something that he's just salty because he can't beat it. I can. It just doesn't happen with any kind of regularity because the cards that they're playing are just way too powerful. Whatever Oko doesn't invalidate, Wicked Wolf and Nissa do. That's the long and short of why the food deck is so good. So, I'm going to be back Thursday for Homeward Path. I don't know yet what we're talking about. This is going to go up tomorrow morning, or I'm going to start the upload middle of the afternoon, late tonight, so that I'll give it plenty of time to render and get uploaded and ready to go. And then we'll go from there. But anybody has questions, comments, concerns, things they want to put forth for next week's episode, let me know. I'm on Twitter at Homeward Path MTG. I'm on Facebook. My name is Adam Spain. If you're in the Facebook group, the Homeward Pathfinders, we talk about stuff in there all the time. If you're a patron of the show of Homeward Path, you also gain access to our Discord. If you want to become a patron of Homeward Path, you can do so over at patreon.com/HomewardPathMTG. That's me. That's my primary focus is the podcast. This show just became kind of an ancillary project to help demonstrate what we're talking about there, so that I wasn't spending all my time on the podcast talking about decks, because it was really easy for me to do that. If you are a patron of $3 or more a month, you gain access to getting to the front of the line for having your decks published on this show. I haven't really had anybody take advantage of that yet. I'm gonna have to holler at some people, find out what they want to do. But that's all I got for this week, everybody. Again, I don't hate the deck. I don't hate the people that play it. I just want it not to be alive anymore. So, that's all I've got. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. However you're consuming the media. And I'll catch you Thursday on this week's trip down the Homeward Path. And then again sometime during the weekend so that we can get this thing up afterward. We'll see you then.